Yeah, so I think we'll get started now. I'm really excited about this. Uh, to be joined by Holly Almon, my colleague and friend. Um, we're gonna, I'll put up the slides in a few minutes, but we're gonna talk. We're gonna basically have a conversation in front of you all, and we hope that some people will join us at the end. We'll have some sort of Q&A time. But what this is really about, and I think whatever ads and stuff we put out about it should have made that clear, is how the models and the simplicity of performance thinking allow us to look at performance both formally in projects and such, and very informally, ad hoc, in ways that are really flexible and insightful and so forth. And so this kind of came out of a series of conversations we had. For our certified performance thinking practitioners, we have monthly meetups, and some of you have participated in that. And Holly's a regular contributor to that. And over the last 6 months or a year, we have these conversations, and I say, wow, she has a lot of really cool stuff to say. So I said, this is it. We're going to have this, we're going to do this in public and have an interesting conversation. So that's pretty much what this is about. Just to tell you, one of the reasons that I really wanted to do this with Holly is that we've known each other for a long time. I've known you, Holly, not too long after you got out of graduate school. I think Shane Isley introduced me to you, and I've watched you move from being a clinician to a clinical supervisor to increasingly large companies, become a performance thinking practitioner, and now doing these really cool projects in a big company. And so, that background, beside the fact that we both come from a behavior science background, seems like a really nice fit. But let me let you introduce yourself a little bit. Tell us kind of a little bit about your background.
Thanks, Carl. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here and honored to be speaking with Carl and all of you today. Let's see, Carl kind of gave the synopsis, but I guess I would say I am a longtime clinician. That's kind of where I started in the field, and working with children with different needs. And I just really fell in love with the behavior science aspect. I'm a behavior analyst and pursued my education in that area. So I started off as a clinician and just started to become more and more interested at kind of what's happening at that process level or that systems level within an organization, whether it's a small organization or a larger one. And I really got interested in kind of teasing out some of those variables and understanding, how does behavior science work at the different levels, the multiple levels, and the complexity of the organization. And so I started working in different opportunities to do some of that work over the years. And so I am the director of clinical development and performance at Centria Healthcare, which is a larger company, a larger organization focused on delivering behavioral services to children on the autism spectrum and adolescents as well. And we serve about 3,000 clients, I would say, at this point, across 12 states, and continuing to grow as well. And I've been using I went through the practitioner program, but even before that, was given a lot of great opportunities to kind of dabble in performance thinking, and known Carl quite a long time and gone to see him speak at many events, and just really, it's a logical framework that makes sense to me. And so I was happy to, try that out and go through some of those different programs to help develop my skill set. And today I'm able to practice that in our organization, and I'm having a lot of fun with that.
Fantastic. Yeah. I should mention, I could give a call out to Shane also, who was here with us, that one of the things, the way I probably met you originally was you were working in an environment where you were applying our stuff to coaching and defining individual roles and so forth. And so that's kind of one end of what we do. And an awful lot of people who do our coaching and supervision and management work don't necessarily do big projects. And so now you're doing big projects. And so you have the opportunity to bring those two together, which I think is another kind of interesting aspect. Well, let me just open up the slides here, and here we go. Here's our pictures again. So a couple of things, just sort of housekeeping stuff. Those of you who are perhaps not so familiar with our work, we have this YouTube channel at performancethinking.tv, and all of our webinars wind up there eventually, but there's some other playlists and such, and it's pretty good, actually. We're starting to put out study guides for some of these webinars also, so you should know about that. Here's some webinars we have planned. We don't know exactly in what sequence, but we want to talk about challenges in organizations as they grow and what we call performance infrastructure, processes, well-defined job descriptions, and so forth, and what the challenges are as organizations grow, that there's problems if you don't manage these things effectively. We want to talk about what a systemic performance intervention is in a future webinar, because everybody talks about that word. You see people say, well, this is a systemic thing, and a lot of times they just mean lots of stuff. And we want to show you how the models of performance thinking allow you to think systemically about performance. Design engineering for performance improvement is a topic that comes from work with my late colleague, Don Toasty, who wanted to emphasize that performance improvement at the organizational level is really a design engineering discipline. It's not just about solving problems, it's about optimizing systems. And there's some interesting things about that over against what some people do, which is just trying to solve problems as opposed to optimize a system. And then actually, next time with a slightly different topic or title, we're going to talk about how this is about making behavior science accessible to people. So those are some future topics. And as I mentioned, our next one, May 17th, is at least titled at the moment, Performance Thinking, Behavior Science, and Performance Engineering for the Rest of Us. And what it's really about, in a way, it's a personal story for me, but it's about the fact that I started out in 72 as a student with B.F. Skinner, the behavior scientist. And I have a lot of colleagues who are very sophisticated behavior scientists, but we tend to talk in nerdy ways that are mostly about what we do, using our technical language. And performance engineering is something that Tom Gilbert and other thought leaders in performance improvement used to talk about as a way to think about performance improvement. But again, it got a little bit nerdy. It got a little bit complicated. And so I've spent a lot of years trying to make the essentials of this stuff accessible to people. And so we're going to talk about the roots of performance thinking and behavior science and behavior engineering, or performance engineering. If you're watching this on YouTube, because of course you're not at the moment, but it will be recorded, please like and share. This is the standard thing that YouTubers always say, and so I got to start to say it myself. And by the way, we are offering these free study guides for our past webinars, so there's a QR code that if you're interested, you can get to the place to sign up for those. So here's today's agenda. I'm going to do a little bit of a spiel, probably for about 15 or so minutes, about the sort of elements of performance thinking. And I just want to highlight the things that we'll be referring back to. This is not going to be a thorough overview, but just sort of touching on the elements and implications of those. And then Holly and I are going to basically have a conversation. And there's kind of two parts to this, although it will go wherever it goes. This is not scripted by any means. But we want to talk about projects where you really follow the whole process that we call performance improvement logic to do analysis and design and come up with recommendations or a plan or a system that you want to implement as a solution to some organizational type of project. But there's an awful lot of times when you're in a meeting or when you're just observing something and some piece of performance thinking becomes useful as a way to clarify. And so we want to talk about both of those. And then there's also some high points that Holly's actually identified that are going to be kind of interesting to explore with you. And then we hope we'll have a little bit of time to talk with all of you guys. So just to do this sort of intro, one of the things is people talk about performance improvement. In the field of human performance technology or human performance improvement, there's a lot of variations. But what I would like to say is that there's at least four essentials. One is, if we're in the lineage of Thomas Gilbert, who I'll talk about briefly, we don't focus on behavior to start. We focus on the valuable products of behavior, which he called accomplishments. And there's a lot of implications of that. Second thing is we do analysis before we design solutions. And that's maybe obvious, but there's an awful lot of sort of jumping to the solution that people do in organizations without actually analyzing what's needed. We also produce systemic interventions, and one of the points that I think we'll get to later is about how all the pieces need to align and fit together. So it's not just a bunch of stuff, it's a system of interventions or components that need to work together as a system. And then also, and this is where really the plain language of performance thinking helps, we want to engage with our stakeholders, with managers, supervisors, leaders, because we can't really make stuff happen without a partnership. So really the work that we do started with Tom Gilbert, who is a mentor and friend of mine a long time ago. But when I first read his book in the early 80s, and then I got to meet him fairly soon thereafter and stayed in close touch until the end of his life, this is what made a big point. He said, he was kind of an iconoclast, and he said in very clear terms, he said, in the great cult of behavior, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. And he wasn't talking about behaviorists. He was talking about trainers, leaders, managers, everybody, because we tend to look at activity. But he followed that by saying we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. Now, I'm just going to move where we are here, because if I don't, we'll miss something. We call accomplishments work outputs. And the reason we do that, and some of you, I think, are from a background in performance improvement. Others may be from a background in applied behavior analysis. But the word accomplishments in both organizational behavior management and also performance improvement has come to mean a lot of different things. And sometimes it means big organizational results. Sometimes it means small things. If you look in the literature, it just kind of means what happens as a product of behavior. And in order to be precise, in order to have what we think of, or at least what I think of as a precise unit of analysis, we use the phrase work outputs because it has two things. One is it's the product of something. It's the product of work, or at least a behavior of some kind. And secondly, notice that it's plural, because we insist that it's a countable noun. And so something like information is not a definable accomplishment or output, but a data set is, or a report or an update. So that has a lot of implications, but that's one of the pieces that we took from Tom Gilbert and then sort of revised a little bit. When we take that all into account, we have this model we refer to as the performance chain, and it's really just the elements of performance. It says that we're trying to produce organizational or business results. That's what's at stake for any given project or intervention, or even helping an individual to perform better. But the way people contribute to those results is they produce what we call work outputs or accomplishments. And in order to do that, they behave in certain ways. And then there are behavior influences, which we'll talk about, which are all the things that are in place or that we put in place that either support or get in the way of achieving producing the required accomplishments or work outputs. Now, we start with work outputs, and that's probably the biggest contribution in some ways of Tom Gilbert. And we've learned that, and I think we're going to be talking about simplicity a little bit later. But the thing is, if you start out with what a person needs to produce, a treatment plan, a decision, a relationship, a widget, a document, whatever it is, a thing, it's a lot easier to then figure out what the behavior is, what the tasks and tactics are needed to produce that. If instead you just start with behavior, you're sort of making your best guess about what behavior would be useful. But we start with accomplishments or work outputs because that's the value delivered. So that, again, has a lot of implications, but it's a key part of this. And this model itself, the performance chain, also, and I think we'll get to this a little bit in our conversation, you always enter into a discussion someplace on this. People say, well, the training's not working, in which case they're probably talking about behavior influences. Or we need to improve our, customer satisfaction. You're starting with business results. Or, whatever it is, you want to get to accomplishments or work outputs and then unpack it from there. But people who are fluent, like Holly and myself and some of the rest of you in this, can go back and forth across this chain easily. And wherever people start, we can get to a place which gives us leverage. So this model is simple but powerful. Here's an example, and those of you from the applied behavior analysis world will probably notice that it makes sense to you. This is an example of what we call an individual performance map. And it might be a little bit hard to read because it's very small print, but this is of a clinical supervisor. And all those things around that center are outputs or accomplishments, and they're delivered to what we call the customers, the behavior techs, the clinical directors, the parents or caregivers. So we can define jobs or roles or individual performance by focusing on their outputs or accomplishments. We can also look at processes this way. And this is a very simple process. but most of you probably are aware that processes are a series of steps of some kind. But what we emphasize is what does each step produce? And so the circled things here are work outputs or accomplishments. So we've worked with very sophisticated process people. We've also worked with people who've never thought about a process in their lives, but we can help people to define the steps in a process and then what the valuable products of each step are, which makes it easier to monitor, to measure, to figure out where things go wrong. It gives us a lot of leverage to focus on the work outputs in a process. And then the behavior influence is part of that performance chain. This is where the 6 boxes model comes in. Now, the quick version of this was that Tom Gilbert had a model called the behavior engineering model, and it was basically this framework. But it had language in it that was not obvious. For example, what we call box 1 was called data. And people would ask questions like, well, what do you mean? Is that like a data set or a spreadsheet, or what is that? Well, really, what he was talking about was information needed to both know what we're trying to accomplish and to know how we're doing, essentially expectations and feedback. And you can go through the cells in here, and if you look back at Tom's model, you'll see that some of the words were just not self-explanatory. So when I got turned on to the behavior engineering model back in the 80s, I was working with teams of consultants that I was leading, and we loved Tom's model. But when we tried to partner with clients, they would, like the second box was called instruments. People say, what is that? Like a violin or an ohm meter? What is that? It was a tool or a resource. So we renamed the cells in the model until we got them so we could introduce them to people and people didn't make many category errors. And so what we did with the 6 boxes model, we didn't call it that yet. One of our clients named it that in about 1991. But what we got with that was a way to communicate with and collaborate with people in a way that was not misunderstood typically. So that's how we frame the variables, if you will, or the behavior influences. And for those who are behaviorists in the crowd, those are functionally defined categories. These are not just sorted out into piles. These 6 categories are things which define functions in relationship to behavior. And so those of you who know about behavior science know expectations and feedback. You could think of that as discriminative stimuli and feedback. Tools and resources are usually missed in a certain way in the behavioral world because the laboratory science just came out of a place where we designed keys or levers for the organism. But of course, in the world of work, it's a lot more complicated than that, and so forth. So these are functionally defined categories, and we get very fluent at using them. If we are aware of these, and if we happen to be a manager or a supervisor, what we recognize is that as a leader or manager or supervisor, big part of our job is to arrange those behavior influences to optimize our employees' productivity and also their engagement. And so once you start looking at the world through this model, you start to recognize that there's optimal ways for managers and supervisors and so forth to essentially support the performance of their people. Now we have a logic, and we're getting to the end of this little intro here, but the logic says if we just sort of paste these 2 models together, so we've got the performance chain, and then under behavior influences, we make explicit what's in behavior influences using the 6 boxes. The logic that we teach people, whether they're coaching an individual or supervising somebody or doing a big, hairy, multiple-year project, is we say, let's first of all know what's at stake. Now, in some not-for-profit organizations, people get a little bit disturbed by the word business results, so we're happy to use the word organizational results. But what we mean there are things like revenue, customer satisfaction, employee engagement, safety, regulatory compliance, quality, and so forth. The things that you would look at the whole organization and decide how well it was doing with respect to those kinds of things. So when we're doing a project of any kind or when we're working with somebody, we want to be sure we know what's at stake here because it makes a difference. Once we know that, then we say, okay, what are the work outputs involved? And so we might be defining the contributions of a job or a role, a profile essentially of a job position, or we might even be coaching an individual, in which case we figure out what their outputs are. Or we might be looking at a big process that has a whole lot of steps in it, and we're going to be finding the work outputs there. But one way or the other, we're finding the valuable products of behavior. And that little circle there indicates that we also want to double check that those outputs actually contribute to organizational results. Because if they don't, why bother? Lean process improvement is about getting rid of waste. And you could say that here we're double checking. We want to be sure that those outputs that people are spending time and effort to produce actually have value. Once we have those two things in place, now we're in a really good position to look at behavior, because now we know it's the behavior for producing this thing, this treatment plan, this proposal, this widget, this assembled device, this relationship, whatever the output is. Let's take a look at what's needed to produce it in terms of behavior. And we can do a task analysis. We can observe people. One of the things that Tom Gilbert taught us was to observe superstars, if there are any, and figure out what the small bits of behavior they do that make a difference. But one way or the other, we're focused on the behavior that produces the work output, not behavior for its own sake. Once we've defined those three elements of performance, now we're in a position to select measures, because you can measure business results. They're typically lagging indicators. You don't get a lot of data frequently. So you got to look for quite a while, maybe months or quarters, to really make a good decision. But that's okay. You want to do it anyway. You can certainly measure and look at and observe behavior, but it's expensive to do it. And so we do it in things like quality and safety environments. We do it when we give people feedback. We do it when we're being sure people follow the procedure, or when we're trying to understand why things are going wrong. Let's take a look and see if you're doing all the right stuff. But it's expensive and challenging to measure a lot of behavior. What we find is that work outputs, once we define what a good instance of a given work output is, we can count them. And very many times, that's the least expensive and best way to get a leading indicator to make decisions about things. So that's the next step in that logic. We decide what we could measure, what the data available are, and so forth. Once we're there, we can now go to the 6 boxes. And we have this thing called analyze, brainstorm, and choose. And it's really slows people down a little bit so they don't just jump to the usual, interventions. What we want is we want people to look at the behavior and interview and observe people and figure out what in each of the cells of these boxes is working or missing or not working or misaligned. And then we want them to do a little design thinking. We want them to brainstorm possible improvements they could make. Maybe they could use a job aid, or possibly they could use some mentoring, or maybe a little more feedback on this until they get it right, etc. So you brainstorm stuff, and then ideally you choose, usually with the stakeholders or the people involved, what are we going to put together as the whole intervention? And so that's a powerful part of it. That's kind of the design thinking part of all this. And then, of course, sorry about that. I guess that step was left out. But then, of course, we implement, measure, and adjust as needed. So that part didn't make it onto the slide. But this is the logic that we apply. And you can apply it in very informal ways. You can apply it in very formal ways. But one way or the other, this is the thought process that we teach people. Now, if you know that, you can apply it at an organizational level. And we have the Performance Thinking Practitioner Program, which certifies people to be organizational level performance consultants. We also, and these are the kinds of applications, by the way, you can do. We like to be explicit about this. And in fact, I have to credit Shane, who I think is still with us, on highlighting this. I created this list years ago thinking, it's just a list of types of applications. But what we've learned over the years is that you approach these kinds of projects differently. If you're looking at a role or an individual, you use that individual performance map to identify their work outputs. If you're looking at a process, you probably do something like a process map to figure it out. If you're wanting to optimize training, be sure that your training works, you're focused on not just the outputs, but the behavior influences, not just skills and knowledge, but the things that have to be in place on the job to be sure that people actually do what they've been trained to do, and so forth. Each of these types of projects implies different ways of approaching the analysis. And so, but it pretty much covers all the stuff you could do as a performance improvement person. And in fact, you can't probably read this very well, but this is a document that I pulled out. I look at every once in a while. We put this together in 2005, and that's when we began to sort of commercialize the performance thinking approach. And what we thought is if we could take those simple models and that logic, we could take all those kinds of people listed across the top: executives, middle managers, frontline supervisors, executive coaches, training professionals, process people, etc. And we could teach them to do a whole bunch of stuff. And so the notion is we have users by applications. And if we can do that with these simple visual models and this logic, that's a pretty powerful thing. And that's what we sort of set out to do in 2005. And I would say we've managed to do all that stuff since then. We've sort of demonstrated in however many years it is, almost 20 years, proof of concept. We can even drive talent development. There's a lot of people in the organizations we serve in HR or in parts of the organization that are responsible for the whole process of bringing in new people, hiring them, training them, getting them up to speed, and then ongoing development. And every single one of those bits, those steps in the process, can be served by focusing on accomplishments. And in fact, that QR code will take you to one of our webinars that really expands in this quite a bit, the notion that you can build your whole talent development framework around accomplishments. And believe me, it's a heck of a lot better than doing it around competencies. And then we have our coaching program. And I mention this only because, again, Holly was doing coaching and working with individuals before doing projects. And this is one of the best ways in many environments to get up to speed on this, because this is about working with one individual at a time or one role at a time to apply the very same logic to help collaboratively that person develop more and more capability. So let's start this conversation. So that was kind of, I hope that wasn't too long or too boring, but that's kind of the context I was trying to kind of set up here. I think I'm going to stop the slides for the moment so you can just see us. There we go. And so let me just set this up a little bit. One of the things that Holly and I were talking about before this started is we could probably do this for 4 or 5 hours if we weren't too tired. There's a lot of stuff to talk about. It's a lot of fun. But one of the ways we're thinking about this, one of the ways to think about this is that you can do projects, as I mentioned. And we want to talk about a few of those because there's lots of different projects where you're in a role that is about developing the whole organization or improving a process or implementing some new thing. And so we're going to talk about a few examples of those. And then, though, are these cases where you're in a meeting and somebody says something and you say, wait a minute, has anybody thought about, what tools and resources you're using or whatever? In other words, you pull a piece out of, or several pieces out of performance thinking, and you find it enables you to be clear and simple about it. So maybe a place to start this is, let me ask you, Holly, about what kind of projects do you want to talk about, or are kind of most interesting to you, or do you think people might like to hear about?
Well, I was thinking of that slide you showed a few slides back when it lists out the projects, and I concur with Shane. I think that is one of the most valuable parts of this process, and having the framework to work within and applying the models of performance thinking across the different types of projects. And you will use the same logic or the same models and same approach or the same framework, if you will, but you go about it in a slightly different way. And I think out of those, big, hairy projects, as you might call them, I think I do a lot of process improvement. That's something I've done a lot of work with over the years, and really working with the project owner, whether that's one of my colleagues or myself, if I'm the project leader, and just really working with the team collaboratively and pulling in all of the stakeholders to really get a seat at the table. Because if you're looking at a process, it's a series of interactions that produce outputs at the end. So the series of steps, what my role is to kind of tie those into that value. So what's that accomplishment at the end of this step? What does that need to look like? How can we count that? How can we make sure we have those criteria outlined to ensure we're on the right track or we're moving forward in that process? So I do a lot of that type of work and working with project leaders and stakeholders to identify those key outputs. Because what happens is once you draw out your current process and your future state process, what you identify is, oh, we might be missing something here. there's this step or this handoff or this transaction was missing this formal piece we need for documentation or a certain type of interaction that needs to occur. And so I kind of extract work outputs or accomplishments, if you will, from lots and lots of steps or lots and lots of behavior and try to get that onto a process. I use a process mapping format to do that. And so I do a lot of that across different processes. This could be anything from onboarding of new staff or looking at our initial assessment process or developing a practicum program or kind of upscaling our intake process, right? So it could apply across a lot of different things because almost everything we do is part of a process. Right. So I find myself doing a lot of extraction of work outputs and really working with the leaders and stakeholders to kind of get those documented. So from there, what we can do is when we're building our implementation plans, we can ensure that that's on the list. Have to make sure we're defining those criteria for those accomplishments to ensure that our...
Oops. What happened? Something just happened.
Can you hear me?
Oh, I can now. Yeah, I think maybe when I change back something. Well, I was going to say, just in response to what you just said, I think one of the most interesting projects, it might have even been your practitioner certification project. It was a few years ago. You took something that was well developed in your field, Hanley's functional analysis thing, and you say, well, wait a minute, this guy's he's got training workshops out there and book and materials, and he's a thought leader and all that. But in order to get it implemented in your organization consistently, you took it to another level. You did a process analysis of the thing. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think it was a really interesting project.
Sure. That is another thing that I do a lot of. It was kind of that training to practice. There's that application. If we, looking at different types of opportunities out in our field, many training, as in any field, right? And what we were finding is a lot of our clinicians were leaving the trainings like, oh, this is great. I learned so much knowledge, but they had trouble applying it to their job and applying it to, the next day at work, so to speak. And so even after thinking about it for several weeks, like, oh, I'm not quite sure where to start. And so what I did was take the material and help bridge that gap a little bit into application. And so what I did was extract a lot of the material and kind of build some outputs around the whole methodology. Mm-hmm. And what that looks like was, some type of reports or assessment data set or applications into a treatment plan, right? And so there's different outputs, and I helped kind of bridge that gap for our clinicians and worked with them to really help them understand what those criteria were that were important to accomplish. So I do a lot of that kind of work too, and kind of breaking down the complexity of things and helping to simplify so that it doesn't become, really this really hairy, complex deal. And you leave with so much great information, so much knowledge, but like, where do I start? Helping to simplify that down for people was really helpful.
So one of the things that I think you did there, and it's something I've done quite a few times, is you're talking about the outputs or the accomplishments. And one of the things that happens is that very often people teach things, and even if it goes beyond skills and knowledge to procedures or steps, a lot of times what each step is supposed to produce, the output is not crisp or clear. And what I've often found, I often say there are processes everywhere, but we don't even see them. So in a lot of organizations, especially smaller organizations that are still evolving, they've got a whole lot of processes they haven't even named. So the first thing is, let's talk about it and name the thing, But then once you name it, people think about it as behavior. But as soon as you define those outputs, you're talking about simplification. My experience is it just clarifies things, because all of a sudden you say, oh, this is supposed to produce whatever, a data set or a summary or a decision or whatever it is. And then that really zeroes you in on what the behavior is for producing that thing. So was that a little bit like what you were describing in that case, the functional analysis case?
It is. And it helps people kind of go step by step a little bit more easily, because they can even evaluate themselves. Have I produced this? So like, have the criteria really crisply outlined, and they can even check themselves. They don't necessarily need me or another supervisor, but it was really fun to be able to coach people through that process and help to break through some of the complexity. And so they could get better results with their clients, which is
So,
ultimate.
yeah, something you mentioned there that I didn't say in that sort of quickie overview, but we use the word criteria. We talk about criteria for a good one. And what we mean by that is once you've defined an output, whether it's a document or a widget or a relationship or decision, we try to identify characteristics of the thing which would make it a good one. What would be a good proposal? What would be a good data set? What would be a good hiring decision? Whatever the thing is. Once you do that, then what you describe becomes a lot easier because people can look at the thing, they can say, oh, it's supposed to be X, Y, and Z. Is it or is it not? And so more and more, the individual performer or the team can take that on as a way to provide their own feedback. And I think the criteria thing is a big deal. It's the hardest part because you got to come up with characteristics that everybody can agree on, where there's no argument about whether the criteria apply or not. But I didn't mention that, but I thought it was worth highlighting because of what you just said.
Yeah, and also kind of going back to the process improvement, the process mapping, and
Mm-hmm.
kind of each of those components, each of those outputs or accomplishments within the process get documented somewhere.
Right.
And so it also helps with implementation planning because you can see like, oh, we have this technology piece that this platform that needs some improvements. Like we need to bank this much time and this much cost toward that. So it can help you really plan out your initiatives up front and adjust as necessary, because some are going to take, it's just as quickly as meeting with a stakeholder for 10 minutes and hashing through those criteria. But some, is a little bit longer of a piece. And when you start building in milestones and some of these bigger accomplishments, then that can get more complex.
Yeah, it's interesting because what you just said reminded me of a kind of early part of my history, which was, oh man, back in the 80s and early 90s even. One of the things I learned is a lot of times if you're training people about something, how to do something, if the overview of the training, if it starts out with, this is the process you're part of, you just do this part, but this is what the process is trying to accomplish. And this is what the people downstream from you, have to do with what you give them and the people upstream hand to you. If you just provide a little bit of an advanced organizer so people understand the context they're in, it's enormously helpful as just a training design thing. And I didn't even get it about accomplishments then. I just got it as context. But what you just said zeroes in that context because you know where the handoffs are, you know what you need from the person upstream from you in order to be able to produce whatever your part is, etc. So that's another, I hadn't thought about it that way until just now, but that's another way which defining these processes, and certainly in the kind of company you work in, an ABA behavioral health company, there's all these clinical and business processes involving,
Right.
reimbursement and developing treatment plans and making all this stuff. And once you define those explicitly as processes and document them, you can not only continuously improve them, but everybody kind of knows the context they're working in.
It also helps with ownership too. So one thing that we have to make sure we do is define the scope of the process itself and kind of at what point does it start and at what point does it end. And I find a lot of times, especially in large organizations, there's some confusion around, well, who does that or who is responsible for this? And helping to kind of clarify those roles and responsibilities within the process and those key outputs that they're accountable for or responsible for producing is really helpful. I mean, I've even created maps with like color-coded phases, like so we can see like this is the cutoff. Or if somebody comes to us and with a request of, well, how about we work on, this documentation or this platform feature? So, well, that's not really within the scope of this process, but that would be this other process over here. So it really helps with definition and clarity. And that's what I feel like, Carl, to one of your questions around those ad hoc, examples, like trying to cut through the complexity and help to bring clarity to people, I think is one piece that I do a lot of every day. A lot of listening to performance challenges and things.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Now I'm just noticing the time, and we could go on for 5 hours, but I want to. So we talked a lot about process. There's another kind of project that I think you might be able to take just a couple minutes, which is you've spent a fair amount of time on individual roles and profiles, right, of roles. Could you, because a lot of times there are projects that are about, oh, wait a minute, here's a role in this company. It's kind of fuzzily defined. Let's define it, and then let's be sure we can support it. So have you got any examples from your history where you could talk about briefly?
Sure. There's many that have to do with role definement and kind of separation of who's responsible for producing certain outputs or accomplishments. And I find that it relates, it comes up a lot in training and development initiatives as well. Like, okay, well, we need to provide training and support, but who's going to manage that at the end? Who is going to help sustain the performance at the end? And then we look at the individual performance map and we say, well, that is part of their job and that is part of their role, but they're focusing a lot over here. And so it can get more and more complex, but it really helps us to come back to those roles and responsibilities and those key outputs on that performance map. And it's helped us to move some things around. Yeah. It's helped also with some leveling of different like clinician levels when we're looking at incentive programs or opportunities for promotion. It's really helping to look at, well, they're both responsible for producing this output. How do we differentiate those? Right. And so there is a stepwise process there. So it's helped to bring clarity to roles, responsibilities, and really trying to figure out, even in developing new roles, we recently had some expansion in one of our departments, and the project owner was looking to expand her department and bring on some new people to help with project implementation, and really working with her to kind of tease out some of those responsibilities and looking at the outputs that we'd be responsible for at different levels. And what it came out, when you have a multi-layer team, what we were finding is that the higher you went up, the more your outputs were related to decisions, recommendations, and solutions, right? And
like senior level roles, right?
Yes, and relationships and the management of those relationships across the organization, even externally. And so it was really interesting to kind of work together and to be able to kind of see those different roles and responsibilities at different levels within a similar department.
Yeah, a bunch of the projects people have done in our certification programs have been around roles. For example, working with a medical insurance company years ago that grew by acquisition. Every state had a medical director, but when they looked at the medical directors, they were wildly different jobs. Yes. So the project was to interview all these people, figure out what their outputs are, and then come back to headquarters and say, how are we going to define the medical director's job? And you can do that with lots of different roles. The other one that's kind of cool, and our colleague, Therese Longo at Radcom, a consulting and training development company and performance company in Ohio, has been focusing on basically job ladders or career paths where you have, sort of engineer level 1, 2, and 3. And in a lot of companies, people kind of have been around for a while, so they get promoted, and you do that for a while, and all these levels kind of fuzz together. And so one of the things that she and her colleagues have done is said, wait a minute, let's get really explicit about what the accomplishments or contributions are of each of these roles so that it's well defined. And it's a clarity thing like you were referring to.
And it really helps. Go ahead. I was going to say the value, it really helps pull out the value of that role. And so when you see it on one paper, like the diagram you showed several slides back, it really helps to see like this is where this role provides value to the organization that contributes to the business results that are important to it, right? And so it really helps to see like what are those valuable pieces there versus like the more costly behavior side of things. Like, well, I do this, I do that, I do that. Well, that's dollar signs, that's cost, that can be expensive, right? But what is the value that is produced as a result of that behavior? Get it into one place, and it's really clarifying and eye-opening for people, and there's a lot of new discoveries.
It's true. The other thing, and actually I think one of our most recent webinars was about this, onboarding and succession planning, because if you define a job by its accomplishments or outputs, if you're onboarding people into it, you can figure out what do you need to get up to speed on in the first week or two, like you got to be able to do these 5 things, produce these. And then what can we wait for a few weeks and a few months? And the same thing for succession planning. If you've got a strategic role that's, a VP of something, and you've got a successor, you can do individual performance maps of each of those roles, see what the person needs to produce when they move into that role, what they're currently capable of contributing, and then you develop them based on the accomplishments. So there's a lot of clarity you can bring to that. Now I'm just, again, looking at our time constraints. And I want to mention one example, because we're talking about ad hoc stuff. and things that just come up in the moment. And a lot of those things have kind of been woven into some of the things you've said, Holly. One of my favorite examples actually was from a person who participated in our practitioner program probably 8 years ago, maybe longer, who was from Fifth Third Bank in Ohio. And she'd only been through like the first 3 sessions. This is a very senior performance person. She knew a lot, but she had never thought about accomplishments or outputs in the way that we teach that. And she was in a meeting where they were talking about this role that used to be centralized, and now they had some of them out in the different bank branches. And so there were people in both settings, and they were kind of stepping on each other's toes. And it was like, oh, what are we going to do about that? And so the way she described it was she was in the meeting and she had accomplishments. She was thinking about accomplishments, and she just asked the question, does anybody really define their work? And the way she described it, it was one of those deer in the headlights moments where everybody in the room sort of was silent for a moment. They realized they hadn't done that. And as soon as they clarified what these 2 positions were responsible for, it was possible to sort it out. And that was just like one little piece from performance thinking that cut through a lot. And I wonder if you got any examples, sort of quick and dirty solutions like that.
You bringing up the meeting, that I really feel like we're working very hard as a department to kind of become more and more accomplishment based each and every day, right? And so looking at like, what are the valuable pieces? Like, what are those accomplishments of our meetings? Are they decisions? Are they solutions? Are they agreements on a certain topic? Consensus, whatever the case may be. So really trying to drive accomplishment. What did we accomplish this week? What are the outputs that we accomplished? Like, were they criteria of a certain output? Was it a whole thing? Was it a whole milestone? So we're really trying to work and kind of shape over time to get better at that too. I think ad hoc, I do a lot of the listening, and people come to me with performance challenges, and I'll listen for, that's kind of when the 6 boxes model kicks in a lot for me. And I start to think through the different boxes and ask a lot of questions of, what's missing. And we might find, box 3, consequences and incentives. Like, there's no positive consequence for something happening, or there's a glaring tool missing, or a resource allocation challenge, and I do a lot of that and helping people to problem solve and kind of analyze, brainstorm, choose informally through those boxes. And I find myself kind of sweeping back and forth a lot across the chains.
Yeah, so this is a pretty good segue on 2 counts. One is, I think we can move into these 3 topics that you wanted to talk about quickly. But what you just described to me is an example of what I often talk about, is getting out of the training box. Because so often people say, oh, well, we got a performance problem, train them. You say, well, that's fine. They maybe need some skills and knowledge. But what about having their supervisors clarify expectations, provide feedback, be sure they got tools, recognize them when they do it right? A lot of times those ad hoc things are just the missing elements, or the misalignment of elements in the 6 boxes. But I wanted to address a chat question, which was one of the things we wanted to talk about that you highlighted, Holly, which is change management. Because a lot of times we're implementing some new system, some new program, and we say, okay, we'll train them and give the performers what they need, and blah, 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 and we're done. But there's a missing element, which is that very often we have to have their supervisors or their managers or some other department provide the behavior influences, the things that are going to help those people perform. And so we have to also work with that level. So somebody here, Jeffrey said, would you please give an example of how performance thinking aids in change management? So can you provide an example of this from your work, Holly?
Sure. As far as like implementation planning and change management,
like how to be sure it happens is really
yeah, absolutely. So any type of implementation plan is a series of outputs for multiple people that play into a process, right? And so we have to get those criteria defined very crisply, looking at that new performance or maybe that improved performance, right? Some things might be brand new. Some things might just be improvement on what's already happening. Let's just do it better, do it to standard or with a higher degree of quality. And so it's really, getting everybody on board for that, and then developing a sequence of plan to make sure that the rollout will be sustainable. And then when you're looking at those 6 boxes, that's where that really comes into play, because consideration of a comprehensive or systemic approach to change management comes, that's where it's very important to consider those variables
Mm-hmm.
and those influences on performance. So we do a thorough analysis there of what that new performance is we're looking for. Then we build that in. But one of the key questions I always ask is, who will be sustaining the performance long-term? So to Carl's point, throw them into a training program. Okay, great. That might give them a set of skills and knowledge, but then who's responsible for making sure it happens back at the job, back at the office? So we have to really make sure we're bringing those folks on board. It's usually the leaders and managers, right? And really making sure to build a plan to make sure that their effectiveness is on point and that they're able to sustain the performance. And so that has to do a lot with providing feedback or giving opportunities to check in on the new performance. How's it going? Measurement tools so they can do quick little check-ins, right? Like, we don't want to make things too cumbersome. How can we automate so that there's data for them to review on a daily or weekly basis?
Right.
And then to meet with the performers long-term and to help build and narrow down in onto those criteria that are most challenging, right? And then to reward those criteria that they're doing well with.
Yeah, one of the things, one way to think about our approach to change management too, and you were sort of giving examples of that. Let me give you an example and maybe make it really obvious. I was involved with a sales development program years and years and years ago. And we had developed some really effective ways to get new salespeople fluent on the knowledge they needed to have conversations with their people. And so we asked their field managers, their sales managers, when you do your check-in with these guys every Friday, could you have a conversation with them a little bit about what they're learning? And what we discovered was that the managers were uptight about that because they weren't in the program and they didn't want to look stupid in front of their people. So this was an implementation planning problem because if we couldn't get that conversation going, it probably wasn't going to happen. So we created little cheat sheets for the sales manager. We gave them 5 or 6 topics with a few paragraphs of background information and some simple questions they could use to get the conversation going with their salesperson. We made it easy for them to do it. And as a result, those conversations started happening. And there was an ongoing, basically expectations and feedback thing going on then between the manager and the salesperson. Now, that's a very simple example. But what we've always said about change management is in order to make the thing sustain, which is kind of what you were pointing to, you need to, I always say, because I used to be a philosophy major, you got to plan all the way up to God, the uncaused cause. But the idea is you want to be sure that the departments and the managers and the other players that provide behavior influences for the target performers are actually doing that. In order to do that, you may have to do some stuff to support their performance, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of the general idea. I don't know if that answers your question exactly, Jeffrey, but that's the general direction.
And go ahead, Carl. I would say leadership from the top, I think, is key as well. And everyone being on the same page and the accountability or checking in or monitoring and reinforcement or rewarding good performance, setting goals, right, for the organization as a whole, so that there are multiple levels of management and multiple levels of accountability there. I think that's really critical for success of long-term maintenance or sustainability of the initiative, is that everyone's watching, everyone's monitoring, everybody's helping each other. We have support set up in different channels in different ways. People are working well together, relationship building. It's a very systemic approach, but I think that's really critical to have that messaging from the top to some of the executive leadership. This is a priority. This is important. We are going to be doing this as a team. And that really helps to kind of rally people up and get people on board. And again, measurement and automation of the data, also very powerful, very powerful and time saving.
So I'm looking at Joseph Hacker's comment about maintenance, which is exactly what you were just talking about. And he says, how do you all account for maintaining variables beyond keeping leaders and managers informed? So we can't always do it. But as Holly is talking about, to have feedback systems built in, one of the things, frankly, one of the reasons we developed our coaching program years ago, and not only for frontline supervisors, for all the way up to leaders, is because we think if people work for you, you need to check in with them regularly. And if you have a conversation which is about what output we ought to talk about this week and how it's going, and what we might do to help support or improve that. If that's an ongoing conversation, and you establish in your organization a culture where people are continuously trying to develop each other's ability to produce those contributions, you've got a big step toward maintaining variables that make a difference. And that's not the whole solution. But I always say there's a lot more managers and supervisors than there are of performance professionals. So if we can get them engaged on an ongoing basis, habitually, culturally, it makes a big difference.
Absolutely.
I'm just looking, it's 2 minutes. I think we're going to go a few minutes over, and I apologize if people have to drop off, but don't worry about it. The recording will come back to you. But I wanted to also ask another topic sort of that Holly had brought up, and then we're having so much Q&A here already, so many good comments in the chat. It's fantastic. But one of the things that you highlighted was the importance within the 6 boxes of being sure stuff is aligned. And that, when for example, if you're a behaviorist and you're talking about, just antecedents, behavior, and consequences, you want to be sure those things are aligned. But when you start looking at the 6 boxes, which is a more robust framework, for example, if you set expectations, you could also give people a job aid that helped to set those expectations. And if that job aid is a good one, you could also use that as a training support tool or a learning tool. If you set expectations, you sure better recognize when people are successful at it. If you have a tool, you better be sure people have the skills and knowledge to use it. So there's this thing of of being sure all the pieces fit together. And so what do you think about, what do you have to say about that, Holly? Because I know you have a lot to say, actually.
I always have a lot to say. I think checking for alignment is really important across those 6 boxes. And so I think one of the big ones I see is when boxes 3 and 6 don't align. So
which
box
are
3,
named employees, so people know what we're talking about.
Yes, sure. The consequences and incentives don't align with the employee's motivation. Mm-hmm. So, people might put into place like, oh, we have, this new swag, or we have this new employee of the month type of recognition program, or, some other common examples and across different industries, but where in fact, like that might be something that is not rewarding to an employer, not motivating to an employee. And so just making sure that we have some incentives in place for them, not saying financial, that's only one type of the incentive, but that there's recognition for a job well done, and that aligns with box 1 with those expectations, to Carl's point, right? Having to make sure that we are inspecting what we're expecting. So that's a misalignment that I see sometimes. I also see a lot of box 1 interventions. So we're going to tell people what they need to be doing and provide some expectations, but then, so that gets communicated in some way, whether it's a memo or a meeting or some vehicle, and then the expectation gets posted into a vault somewhere that nobody looks at.
Right. Nothing.
They get shoved into a vault to never be seen again. And nobody, where can I find that doc? I see a lot of box 1 only interventions. And so as we would know, like performance might increase for a little bit, but then it's going to wax and wane, and it's going to probably die out. So just ensuring that we're considering the tools and resources to support that, the skills and knowledge to support that, and we're doing a more comprehensive analysis.
The other thing about what you're saying, and it reminds me of something I always often do, which is box 1, expectations and feedback, is box 1 for a lot of reasons. And I've never seen a performance problem that didn't have the opportunity to improve on expectations and feedback in one way or the other. And one of my favorite things to do, actually, is if I'm involved as a performance consultant, interviewing performers and then their managers, you ask the managers and you say, oh, your objective's real clear for your people, and how do you set expectations? You ask questions about that. They say, oh, yeah, we say this all the time, and we're very explicit about it. We set goals. You go talk to the people, and you say, I don't know. He's always talking about all this stuff, but I have not a clue what the deal is. You will, and this is where the functional analysis comes in, because an expectation is only an expectation if it is. And so you can, as you say, put that in the vault, and it's not going to have any effect on people's behavior. So very often we need to check to be sure people actually know what's expected of them, and then to give them feedback and all the rest of it. It's not just kind of one thing in its own little cell,
And we have to ensure that the environment is supportive of that too. And from the consideration of, even time, resources, tools, that they're not hard to use to where people are afraid to use them or don't want to bother. Also the expectations of different parts of their jobs, that are we more heavily weighing these versus those? And then these get dropped off because people get busy or overwhelmed. And so there's all this balance to consider. It's a very comprehensive way to think about it, but the models provide that simplicity to really kind of go through. And I told Carl, a few weeks ago, I haven't seen anything that doesn't fit in one of the 6 boxes.
Yeah.
Really, when you're looking at influences from the environment or individuals. So
well, and that's that's the important point, because if you look at a lot of the models out there, and we're going over time here, so we should probably stop and then see if people have some more comments or questions. But one of the things is, if you look at a lot of the models for performance improvement or behavioral systems, you see these categories of interventions or of variables, but they're not functionally defined. They're just a whole bunch of different words. And one of the things I believe is that the 6 boxes model, and I don't take any credit for this is with Tom Gilbert. We just renamed the stuff and used it in a slightly different way. But I don't think there's anything that can affect people's behavior performance that doesn't either fit in one of those cells or in relationships between them. And like Holly just said, I mean, I was trained as a behavior scientist 50 years ago, and I've been looking at this from that angle as well as from a practitioner point of view. And what I love about this framework is that in 6 categories, you can pretty much sort everything out, and you can pretty quickly find out, like when you have an employee engagement issue, for example, usually if you look at the behavior influences that are influencing people, you say, oh my God, no wonder. They have all these conflicting expectations. They're working their tail off to meet expectations and nobody notices. They've got crappy tools. Whatever it is, you say, of course, you can float those variables to the surface. Anyway. Is there anything maybe we should just ask. So you guys are doing lots of chat here, and we could go on for another hour, but we don't want to. Any questions or comments other than the fine things you've already said in here? Anyone? You still with us? We still got 31 people or so. That's pretty good. So what do you think, folks? I'm just looking at a lot of the comments that you already have made. One of the things Matt said, was one of our most recent star practitioners, but Matt Frizzlin, he says, what you just said about links to box 3, one of the things that I think about box 3, consequences and incentives, is that extrinsic consequences and incentives are important. We want to say thank you to people. We want to recognize people. We want to do stuff. We want to be sure their compensation is aligned and all that. But honestly, I'm more interested in arranging all the rest of the behavior influences so that people are very successful at their jobs and like it and care about it. I really believe that, I know from my own work, like when I produce a good article or piece of work of some kind, it's like, ooh, this is cool. It's a reinforcer. And so that's not the only thing, but I think thinking about box 3 as not just the things that we give people after they were successful, but actually enabling them to be successful in producing something of value. I think that's a big deal that's sometimes underlooked, Anything else? Are you looking at the chat?
I am. Looks like some people had to jump off.
A lot of good stuff.
I don't see any direct questions.
I think Joseph
Hacker, makes a good point. And performance management not being or being way more of a nonlinear process than in nature.
Yeah, and Don Gibson, Tom Gilbert stressed in Human Compass, all 6 boxes. Yeah, the 6 boxes are happening whether you know it or not. I mean, those are the variables that are in place, and they may be working positively or not. But those are the factors that are, and they may be all screwed up, but of course they're there.
That's what the analysis will help you learn, right? Sort through.
Anything else? Well, we don't want to keep you going too long here, but thank you everybody for your engagement. Any final comments, or because I've got a couple more slides, but any final comments, Holly, that you want to make?
No, I think we covered quite a bit. As you
Oh,
said, we could do this every month probably.
easy.
So
Well,
easily.
let me just continue. Oops, except I can't. That's very interesting. Oh no, that's not true. Hold on. So let me just finish up here a little bit. I'm gonna show this some takeaways, which are, and I think Holly said this a bunch of different ways. The simplicity of these models help us think clearly about performance. And we can do big stuff as well as small stuff. And I think the third bullet, which is we use these models to clarify, simplify, and address challenges, both day to day and in projects, but it's a way to cut through complexity. And then the shared language, and we haven't really talked that much about that. But when you work in an organization and you've got the folks that work in that organization, both managers and leaders, as well as performance professionals or staff people, beginning to share this language, it's a big deal. It starts to establish, an efficient collaborative environment or culture. Our next performance thinking practitioner program, a couple people expressed interest in that. The next open one starts September 11th, which is quite a ways off. But I'm more than happy if we get a bunch of people interested to run an open program this summer. So if you or your colleagues are interested, email me at carlbinder@sixboxes.com, and I'm happy to try to put together. We need a group of like at least 8 people, but if there's more people interested from different locations, we'll be happy to do it. We also have a coaching program from years ago, but we've recently redesigned it to be completely virtual, kind of as a result of COVID. And so we're going to be probably piloting that in an open version in the coming months with it at a pretty discounted level. So sort of keep your eye out for that. It'll either show up in emails you get or possibly at our LinkedIn group, the Performance Thinking Network. But we're kind of excited to do that because it will make it available to a lot more people. The other thing I want to mention, I already said this, but this is our 30th webinar. And we realized a couple months ago that we have an opportunity to help people get more out of those. So we are beginning to create these simple study guides for individuals, or if you have a reading group or something like that, where you can watch the webinars and then sort of think about the questions and activities that we suggest. We've done, I think, 5 of them now. If you want to subscribe to them, you can point your phone at this QR code, and it's an easy thing to sign up for. And then I guess we're at the end here where we were going to say any further questions or comments. It looks to me like we're probably done. So thank you, Holly. This was as delightful as I thought it would be. We'll probably go on for several hours later, but
yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm honored to be here and
yeah, it's good.
Always learn new things.
Okay, thanks everybody. I think we're done.
Thanks everyone.
All righty.
Bye.